Good. Well, thanks very much, Brian, and thanks very much, Judith, and thanks very much too to the Oxford Martin School for putting on this event. Now, Tony is rightly seen as the leading scholar of modern research on inequality, and his 2015 magnus opus, Inequality, What Can Be Done, is often referred to as his last book. The good news, of course, you already know, is that a new Atkinson book was published in June on the subject of poverty. And this book comes exactly 50 years after Tony's first book, published in 1969, also on the subject of poverty. So Tony's first book was on poverty. There it is on the left. It was concerned with poverty in Britain, just Britain. 20 years later, Tony wrote a book that broadens the whole of Europe, a very nice little book, Poverty in Europe. And in the decade that followed that, he, along with others, including Brian, did much to advance the European Union's measurement of social indicators. But with this book, Tony's perspective turns truly global. Okay, I want to start by focusing on two words in the title. The first is measuring. Now, this is principally a book about measurement, something that Tony rightly saw as essential in the fight against poverty for various reasons: for motivating concern about poverty, for designing policy to combat it, to judge progress made in combating poverty, and something that was very important for Tony, to hold leaders to account for the goals that they have agreed to, notably the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of which the very first goal is end poverty everywhere. But the book, in fact, is not only about measurement. The title is therefore a little restrictive, and that will become clearer when I describe the structure later on. The second word I want to focus on for a minute is around. This is a book about poverty around the world in two senses. The first sense is that it provides a guide to measurement that can be used in any country, rich or poor. So in this sense, around means anywhere in the world. And there are numerous examples in the book of national measurement of poverty, in part drawing on an appendix that was planned to have 60 case studies of national measurement of poverty in countries at all levels of development. The second sense the book is about poverty around the world is it provides a guide to how you could arrive at a global total for poverty. So around here means sort of gathering together of all countries. So how many poor people are there in the world? What are the steps needed to arrive at such a total? And critically, what are the assumptions that lie behind those calculations? Okay, having said that the book is not just about measuring poverty, what are the key themes in this, its principal focus of measurement? Well, the first one I've already noted, that the importance of measurement. The second is that poverty can be interpreted in different ways. As Tony said, it's a contested concept. And those differing views about poverty have differing implications for how poverty should be measured. Thirdly, the book stresses that poverty is multifaceted. It's not just a question of a low level of your income or your consumption. Fourthly, good data are vital. That's a major theme of the book, and Tony cites the World Bank president as having said, collecting good data is one of the most powerful tools to end extreme poverty. And he notes that huge progress has been made, but much more is needed. And finally, Tony calls for the systematic comparison of measurement by national bodies, ministries, statistical offices, with the measurement done by international organizations such as the World Bank or the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. And he argues that that serves two purposes. Firstly, it provides a cross-check on the conclusions shown by different methods or sources about how poverty has changed over time or about the composition of the poor, where any inconsistencies that can't be explained must sound as a warning bell to users of either set of data. And secondly, he argues that that comparison provides legitimacy to both sources of measurement, national and international, and eventually to the policy decisions that are based on those measurements. Well, as Brian and Judith have explained, the book grew out of Tony's work writing the 2016 report of the World Bank's Commission on Global Poverty, which he chaired and which he wrote single-handed. And the book draws on that report, but it goes well beyond it and is much broader in its aims. The report was written to advise the World Bank on its measurement of poverty and was restricted to discussing methods with little or no analysis of data. Whereas the book starts from first principles about what we mean by poverty. It then translates those principles into concrete measures and then finally analyzes the data to which the measures can be applied. And as I've noted, it also addresses substantive issues of which the World Bank report was, on which the World Bank report was silent, alongside its discussion of methods and its analysis of poverty data. Now, in planning his book, Tony placed a big emphasis, as I've already stressed, on documenting countries' own national measurements and on the comparison of these with the measurements done by international organizations. And I just want to illustrate that point with a graph from the book for rural China that shows poverty rates plotted on the vertical axis against time over a period of some 40 years. Now, there are three series in that graph that are labeled national. They are poverty rates estimated by the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics. And then there's one series calculated by the World Bank based on its $1.90 per day per person in purchasing power parity terms, absolute poverty line. And that's the solid line with squares, and you can notice in the late 1980s, there's a break in that series where the World Bank switched from using income to measure poverty to using consumption to measuring poverty. And we can see a gap in the series there. And Tony was very careful about this sort of issue, not to, as we say in the book, join up the dots, as we say in our foreword, when he wasn't convinced that a series was consistent over time. Now, the good news is there's good broad agreement about the huge fall there's been in poverty in rural China between the series currently used by the Chinese, the series 3 in the diagram with the circles with the grey shaded centres. Very broad agreement between that and the World Bank series. So that's good. But Tony was particularly interested in recent developments. And I've circled there at the end the group of dots that include the change between 2012 and 2013, where he noted these differences have a major impact on your estimates of the change in world poverty. The World Bank poverty rate there falls by nearly 10 percentage points in 1 year, whereas the National Bureau of Statistics series falls by less than 2 percentage points. Now, if you translate that into absolute numbers, that means the World Bank series was falling by some 63 million people. So 63 million less poor people in rural China. And that made up over half the total world fall in poverty in that year. Whereas the National Bureau of Statistics figures falls by less than 20 million. So which series you take has a huge impact on your conclusion about what's happened to world poverty in that year. Now, we argue, Andrea and I in our forward, that this is a classic Atkinson volume, this book. And we place it in the forward within the sort of arc of Tony's career and his huge research output starting before that first book in 1969, but that was the first book 50 years before this one. And we discuss the progression in Tony's sort of intellectual contribution and argument in the measurement of poverty, both theoretical and empirical, across that 50 years. Now, Tony left an incomplete draft and asked Andrea and I to take it forward. And we quickly decided that completing the book would be impossible. There was too much left to do, especially in the book's second half. And we might have imposed our own ideas and co-authored the book, and that's something the Atkinsons encouraged us to think about. But we were clear from the outset that this book should remain Tony's alone, and not be co-authored by us. So with the agreement of the Atkinsons, we decided to bring the book to a state where it could be published while remaining incomplete. So we edited Tony's material. We added some new material in the ways that we describe in the forward. And we invited Nick Stern and Françoise Bourguignon, both long-standing friends and co-authors of Tony, to write to afterwards to deal with topics that Tony wanted to cover, but where he ran out of time to do so. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Well, it remains an unfinished book, but it's got over 400 pages, some 90 graphs and tables. It weighs about 100 grams more than Inequality, What Can Be Done. It's a substantial book. It remains unfinished, but the unfinished chapters offer a foundation on which other researchers can build, and indeed a challenge to them to do so. Now let's have a look at the contents of the book in more detail. Well, the slide shows 10 chapter titles, 4 of which, chapters 6 to 9, have a focus on particular regions or groups of countries. 2 afterwards, genesis of which I've described. And then a substantial appendix with 60 national reports, national poverty reports, as Tony called them, for a range of countries from all over the world, rich and poor. And these are 2-page accounts, concise 2-page accounts of national measurement of poverty, with a graph comparing trends over time for those national poverty measures with measures produced by international organizations, notably the World Bank and the UNDP. And I've shown you the graph for rural China. There are 2 graphs for China, rural China and urban China, from those national reports. And the book is an example of what you'd call Tony's principled approach to research that he followed throughout his career. Namely, that there's no measurement without theory behind it. Conversely, the theoretical developments are valuable only to the extent that they're liable to be applied in practice. And thirdly, behind this whole exercise of measurement, researchers have a duty to make explicit the ethical judgments that are embedded in their chosen measures. Now, the first chapter illustrates that principled approach straight away, especially the role of ethical judgments. Now, if you take estimates of world poverty, such as those made by the World Bank, using its $1.90 a day poverty line, they invariably weight each poor person around the world equally. So you take the number of poor people beneath the $1.90 a day line in China, you add that to the number of people beneath the line in Brazil, beneath the line in South Africa, beneath the line in the USA, and just add these all up, weighting them equally. And Tony describes that as a cosmopolitan approach to estimating global poverty, and much of the book's discussion and estimates of total world poverty is based on that ethical judgment that people should be weighted equally. But he offers alternatives, notably what he calls a limited sympathy approach, in which you give full weight to the poor within your own country, and then a weight less than 1 to the poor outside your own national borders. And that, of course, has the implication that the global poverty total varies with the country where the calculation is being made. So there's a nationally specific count of world poverty. Chapter 2 presents different approaches to measuring poverty: subjective assessments based on judging what a household's basic needs are, Amartya Sen's capability approach, and finally assessments based on principles of human rights, where we note that we think Tony would have added more in time, perhaps commenting on the approach taken by the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. It's Philip Alston currently, whose recent report in May of this year, following his visit to the UK in November, received such a lot of attention. Chapter 2 also introduces an idea for measurement of a global total based on work that Tony did 20 years ago with Françoise Bourguignon, where they proposed that a poverty line for application across the world is an absolute one at lower levels of development, and then at a certain point begins to rise as national income rises. Something they rationalise, thinking theory behind measurement always, they rationalise using Sen's capability approach, but also note that it reflects what has long been seen to be the case in practice, not surprisingly, that national poverty lines rise with income. So here's a graph taken from the, not from the book, but from the 2018 edition of the World Bank's biennial publication, flagship publication, Poverty and Shared Prosperity. And that's a report full of analysis that takes on board Tony's recommendations for measurement in the report of the Commission on Global Poverty, including this particular recommendation based on his work 20 years ago with Françoise Bourguignon. Now, we've got poverty lines plotted on the vertical axis in purchasing power dollars per person per day, and then average income plotted on the horizontal axis in the same measure, and each of those dots represents a poverty line at some point in time for a country. Now, here's the World Bank's $1.90 a day poverty line. If you applied that everywhere in the world, it's somewhat higher than a good bunch of poor countries. They're clustered at the left-hand side of the diagram, but it's clearly a lot lower than the poverty lines used in many other countries that are richer than that. And one of Tony's suggestions in the book is to have a poverty line that instead is like this. So it starts at $1.90, gets up, in fact, in this case, to $3. Once you get to a median income of average income of $3.80, then it rises at the rates of 50 cents in the dollar. And as you can see, that particular proposal that he made fits these data that the World Bank has shown in their recent report on poverty lines, the data on poverty lines quite well. Obviously, key things here are where that kink point comes and the rate at which the line rises. Now, Chapters 3 and 4 then build what Tony calls a checklist of the questions he believed one should ask when faced with any statistics on poverty. He makes frequent references here to the 60 national reports at the end of the book to illustrate his arguments. Chapter 3 focuses on clarifying the concepts. So if a monetary measure is being used, should that be income? Should that be consumption? And how are those two concepts defined? If the aim is to arrive at a global total, how do you adjust for differences across countries and the cost of living using a purchasing power parity exchange rate? What about non-monetary indicators? For example, the absence of a particular item in the home or lack of access to clean water. And Tony wanted to give a lot of prominence to these measures of poverty. He noted that the targets under the Sustainable Development Goals poverty targets refer to reducing poverty, quote, in all its dimensions. So what indicators are chosen in practice to pick up the dimensions, say health or education, and how are they combined into a single measure? Should they be combined into a single measure? So Tony's here in practice discussing in particular the measures developed, as Brian has already noted, by Sabina and her colleagues at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative that for several years now have been published by the UN in the Human Development Report of UNDP. And he also discusses the measures produced by Eurostat for EU countries, measures of material deprivation. Chapter 4 then considers the data underlying the statistics on poverty. What are they? Do real data exist, or are they actually just imputations? And how comparable are data across countries and across time? Now, chapter 5 marks a transition in the book from considering concepts, possible measures, available data, to analysis of existing data. And here the book begins to get much less complete. One thing Tony wanted to do here in this chapter was compare estimates of monetary poverty produced by the World Bank based on the $1.90 a day line with the non-monetary measures of poverty published by the UNDP in collaboration with Sabina and her colleagues. Now, these non-monetary measures of poverty, non-monetary poverty rates, are based on bringing together indicators of education, health, and household conditions. So the question is, do they tell the same sort of story as the monetary measures of the World Bank? So drawing on Tony's notes and files, we included some limited analysis of the data along the lines that he had already started, and we point to the directions that we think he might have taken with that analysis. And this diagram is one that we found in Tony's files. It plots the poverty rate estimates by Sabina and her colleagues on the vertical axis, the non-monetary poverty rates, against the World Bank's poverty rates on the horizontal axis, based on the $1.90 a day poverty line. And there are some 70 countries in that graph with the rates, there's two rates being based on the same year for each country. Now, broadly speaking, the two sets of rates move up together as shown by the line, the curved line that Tony superimposed on his graph. But there are countries that are a long way away from that line. So take Swaziland and Chad, where the World Bank $1.90 a day line is essentially the same, but there are these huge differences in non-monetary poverty rates. Or compare Mauritania, there on the left-hand side of the diagram, and Zambia and Rwanda on the right-hand side, both with non-monetary rates of some 55 to 60%, but with monetary rates that are very, very different. And we think Tony would have delved into explaining those differences and trying to resolve those apparent paradoxes. And we also note, we think he would have looked at trends in the two sets of data. Do they tell the same story over time. That's a subject that Sabina and colleagues have looked into themselves. Now, in chapters 6 to 9, Tony intended to do two things. Firstly, he wanted to use the data he had assembled in the 60 national reports at the end of the book to answer a standard set of what he called key questions about poverty levels and poverty trends for each of the 4 regions or groups of countries listed there. In each case, he planned to compare the evidence from the national studies with estimates from the international agencies, drawing on all those graphs in his national poverty reports of the type that I showed you for rural China. But as with chapter 5, much of the analysis that he had planned here is missing. The same is true for most of the second thing that Tony planned for these 4 chapters. He was to consider what he called a series of general issues, 2 per chapter, different for each chapter, about either the causes and correlates of poverty or about its measurement. And if you look at those subjects, these are not minor issues, they're big issues. And the discussion, indeed, was not to be restricted to just the countries that made up the region or group with which a chapter was principally concerned. So chapter 6, titled Asia, this discussion here of these 2 topics was not just going to be about Asia, it was going to be cross-cutting across the world. So there was ambitious and complex structure for these chapters. Now, Andrea and I decided that the first 2 of these general issues, those for chapter 6, the ones that Tony clearly saw as probably the most important, really should be covered in the book, and hence our invitation to Françoise Bourguignon and Nick Stern to write there afterwards, which have really added to the book. They're both about 4,000 or 5,000 word essays at the back of the book. Nick Stern writing on the relationship between efforts to reduce climate change, to halt climate change, and efforts to reduce poverty. And Françoise Bourguignon writing on the relationship, the interrelationship between poverty, inequality, and economic growth. Now, one of the issues that was to be dealt with in chapter 9 was the estimation of global totals of monetary poverty based on that poverty line that I mentioned earlier that he and Françoise Bourguignon had worked out originally 20 years ago, in which the World Bank have now become now included in their analysis and their reports, one with an absolute line to begin with that then rises. And Tony here made substantial progress, providing estimates for 2013 based on 2 different lines, yielding figures of over 1 billion in one case and 2 billion people in the other case living in poverty. Chapter 10 concludes, and Tony finishes in a characteristic upbeat way, his innate optimism on display. As far as the measurement of poverty is concerned, he argues that this cannot be static and that researchers from different disciplines have to be broad-minded. But at the same time, he concludes that despite the holes in the data and their variable quality, in broad terms, the evidence around the world is sufficient in the sense that policymakers in most countries cannot say they don't know enough in order to tackle poverty. And one section in this chapter indeed is titled, "We Know Enough to Act." Tony argues that what is lacking is actually political will. And here we are coming back to the point he makes at the start of the book about the importance of measuring poverty, that politicians have accepted ambitious goals for tackling poverty that are embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. They've signed up to them. And now we need to hold politicians to account, with measurement being vital for that. Thank you.